Good evening, everybody. Welcome to the Daiwa Anglo-Japanese Foundation. My name is Jason James, and I'm going to be chairing this evening what I'm sure will be a very lively discussion about immigration. Right, well, we've got a pretty full house for what I know is going to be probably a contentious subject, immigration in Japan and the UK. And I mean, in a nutshell, the UK has tried quite a lot of it, and Japan hasn't yet. So there should be lessons to be learned, certainly in one direction and maybe in both. And so our two speakers tonight I'll briefly introduce. First of all, Kristin Surak is a senior lecturer in Japanese politics at SOAS, and she specialises in migration issues, but also in nationalism, in culture and sociology. Her book, Making Tea, Making Japan, received the Outstanding Book Award in 2013 from the American Sociological Association's section on Asia. And she's also quite widely commenting in the media on Japan-related issues. Now, talking of the media, Bill Emmett, our other speaker, is an independent writer, speaker and consultant. He was, from 1993 until 2006, the editor-in-chief of The Economist, and is also known as an expert on Japan in particular. He's written 6 books on Japan, and at least 2 of them were bestsellers in Japan. I remember particularly The Sun Also Sets, a negative book on Japan which came out in 1989, just at the peak of Japan's bubble, and proved, of course, very prescient. So I'll leave it at that. Kristin, would you like to go ahead?
Thanks very much. I thought I saw it with a very recent image of a woman who's become very famous in Japan recently. I suppose I'm a bit curious about how many people in the audience might know who Miss Japan for the Miss Universe contest is. Anyone know her name? It's, sorry? Miyamoto Ariyama. Has been elected Japan's representative. She's 21 years old, from Nagasaki, and caught a lot of people off guard because, as you may notice, in some ways she's very beautiful, but she also has a black African-American father as well. And in a sense, she represents almost an image of both a changing and yet an unchanging Japan in this field of international migration. So what I'm going to do today is introduce sort of the basic contours of what international migration and foreigners in Japan look like today, and then touch on some key issues that arise in the areas of economics, crime, and integration, which might be on many people's minds. So just to give sort of a general overall picture, some of these might be hard for those in the back to read, but I've taken them largely from the Ministry of Justice website, so I didn't make too many adjustments to them. There's about 2.3 million foreigners in Japan at the moment. About 1.4 million of those are permanent residents of the country, making a life in Japan of various sorts. You can see the increase over time, really taking off a little bit under 1 million up until about the 1990s, then really taking off, and then sort of plateauing by the mid-2000s at around 2.3 million today, or about between 1.6 to 1.8% of the populations. It's famously, this is a very small number, under 2%. If we put Japan then, compare Japan to its OECD neighbors, we see it coming down, and again, I apologize for the small graph. Japan is the little red bar, if you can see it, in the left-hand corner, right below Korea. Japan is about 1.6 million foreigners. Korea has more, about 1.6% of the population is foreign. Korea is slightly higher, about 2% of the population is foreign. France, you can see in the middle, is about 6%. Then comes the United States, orange bar, 6.8%. And I've put in the UK as well, which is 7% foreign. So Japan against the other countries in the OECD is quite low. But who are these fairly intrepid people who managed to get in? Well, the first group, and probably the longest standing, are the Zainichi Koreans, the resident Koreans. There's about 500,000, 500,000, currently in Japan. And they came to the country largely as a result of various programs of labor constriction, marriage, economic reasons coming out during the heydays of the Japanese Empire. You can see a big uptick in the number of Koreans in Japan coming after 1935, and then a huge decrease after the end of World War II. But still, about 500,000 did not go home, in part because the Korean War broke out, and some of them had businesses in Japan, etc. It made it, they were reluctant to leave. Nonetheless, their numbers have declined in recent years. You can see it gradually tapering off. And a lot of this is due to either naturalization or to mixed marriages. In fact, 90% of the Korean population in Japan, or of the new marriages coming up, are with Japanese, not Koreans. And through intermarrying with Japanese, it's been a strong force towards their integration. You can see the number of Korean women with Japanese husbands is in that sort of yellowish bar, and the number of Korean men with Japanese wives is the reddish bar. And the Korean marriages in which both parts of the couple are Korean is the blue bar at the bottom. It's about 10% of new marriages formed today. And this is very important for integration, something I'll come back briefly at the end. But what we've seen in addition to this large, long-standing Zainichi Korean population are a whole group of newcomers coming in since the 1980s in the economic takeoff, but also for several other reasons. It's sort of a hodgepodge group of people, including entertainers, new Koreans, etc. But the largest amongst them are the Chinese, which have now outstripped the Koreans and become the largest foreign population today. There were only about 150,000 Chinese in Japan in 1990, and now there's about 650,000. You can see the takeoff of the Chinese. They're this sort of dark line over here that takes off and has become the largest group today, 650,000 Chinese. Koreans are the purple line up at the top, gradually tapering off. The light blue line are the Brazilians, peaking in 2008 and now also tapering off. Filipinos have reached the plateau, but they're in there as well. A lot of them are marriage migrants. And we also see a gradual increase of low-skilled workers from Vietnam. To break down what some of these key categories within this are, one of the most sort of well-known groups, of course, are the largely Brazilian Nikkei. These are second to third generation children of Japanese immigrants, usually to Latin America, largely to Brazil and Peru, who, after immigration reform in 1990, were able to come to Japan fairly easily because the government decided that the children of Japanese nationals up to the third generation could come to the country to participate in cultural activities and visit ancestors' graves, while at the same time the government gave them a 3-year visa with no work restrictions that could be renewed on an unlimited basis. So, as one might imagine, it became a pretty easy backdoor to for cheap labor, and the Brazilians took off. Brazilian numbers took off as a part of this. They often take up dispatch work in assembly lines in places like Nagoya and Gifu, and in a sense are part of the population of people on temporary contracts in semi-skilled manufacturing jobs. Another important group are the trainees. This is also a result of immigration compromise in the 1980s. There's currently about 150,000 trainees in the country doing low-skilled work. Now, the Ministry of Justice and JITCO, which runs the scheme, describes it as a sort of work abroad program for people in developing countries. They're allowed to come to Japan to develop skills in things like fish gutting over 3 years, and take those human capital skills in things like fish gutting back home. The government doesn't like to call them workers or guest workers. It talks about it in terms of metaphors like scholarships and study abroad. But this program is one that's had some serious problems come up. And in fact, the US State Department and the United Nations High Council on Refugees have stated that it amounts to trafficking and slavery in some of their reports. The trainee, so there's a lot of problems and oversight going on with this program. It's come into the news a bit recently because Prime Minister Abe has rolled out plans to expand the program in preparation for the Olympics, allowing about 5,000 people per year to come in to work particularly in the field of construction. 5,000. That's not a lot. And that is, in a sense, one of the key themes that comes up over and over again when looking at international migration in Japan. Another important growing group in Japan are students. Back in the early 1980s, when Japan was still under this, many people still often said Japan has no foreigners at all in it. Prime Minister Nakasone tried to get 100,000 foreign students into the country. Now, actually, there's about 200,000 students studying at Japanese universities. They're largely Chinese, as you might imagine, due to language issues. And they're often filling empty student slots that have come up as the younger birth cohorts are diminishing in size. Now, students are a little tricky to deal with. They're a very diverse group. Because students in Japan are allowed to work up to 28 hours a week and it's not really monitored, some of them become de facto workers. But some of them also go on to get university jobs. And Japan, I think much to its credit, has recently instituted a new visa category to allow foreign graduates of Japanese universities to stay on and work after graduation. And currently there's nearly 60,000 have chosen to do so, and it shows that they're using the skills and human capital that they've acquired in Japan still in the country. It's actually a very good move for Japan. Now, if those are the sorts of migrants we do see, migrants and foreigners, who don't we see? One are care workers. Well, actually we see some, but really not all that many. Since 2008, Indonesia and Philippines have organized through bilateral agreements the opportunity for about 1,000 care workers to enter the country every year. All of these care workers, if they want to stay on after 3 years, however, must pass a very difficult exam in Japanese for nursing qualifications. So the bar is actually very high for them to stay in the country, and only about 24 of them have passed this exam so far. That's less than the number, it's probably about the people on this side of the front room who've managed to stay on. So we don't see a lot of care workers. Japan in 2012, like many countries, got on the boat and rolled out a point system for highly skilled workers. These people were, are the research, business management, and specialized technicians who were supposed to bring innovation to Japan and push the workforce forward. And if you filled out a form and got 70 points based on your education, age, salary, work experience, you got a visa to stay up into Japan for up to 5 years, as well as bring your spouse and maybe even eventually settle. Now, the initial target for this was 2,000 people per year. There's probably more than this going through Piccadilly Circus every day. How many did it get from abroad coming into Japan in the first year? 17. Now, the actual numbers were a little bit higher. It was 430 because there were people already in Japan who switched to that visa status. But the intention of the program was not really fulfilled. The second year did a little bit better. It got 60, probably as many people in this room. So it's sort of sputtering along. People who do this, are also usually Chinese. About 60% are. Well, the final group we don't see in Japan are refugees. Japan gets a couple of thousand refugee applications every year, but only grants about a few dozen of those. So it's something that they've managed to create an image as a place that's unwelcoming, which is quite different from the European situation, but something that Japan as a sovereign nation certainly can do. So what's the upshot? Well, there are two key principles in border control in Japan. Number one is that there's no immigration. That is intake purely for settlement. I remember in an interview with a member of the Ministry of Justice who told me, if you're a Nobel Prize winner and you get off the airplane and enter the airport at Narita and say, I want to settle here, our guards are supposed to turn you away. because there's a general thrust towards no immigration. People can come in, and if they end up staying, then there's pathways to citizenship, et cetera, but there's not intake purely for settlement. Indeed, it's harder to become a permanent resident in Japan than it is to become a citizen, at least on paper. The bar in order to apply for citizenship, you have to be resident in the country for at least 5 years, have good moral behavior, be able to support yourself, etc. To apply for permanent residence, you have to be in the country for at least 10 years. And I've asked people, why is it, it's a little bit counterintuitive, but they say, well, nobody wants citizenship, so we place the higher bars at the permanent residence line. The other part is that officially Japan does not allow in low-skilled workers. And this is, all government officials know that this is the company line. Nonetheless, the economy makes very good use of these. They can be very useful to the economy. And so there's a lot of backdoor schemes, like the trainees, like the Brazilian Japanese, like student workers, etc. So if this is a broad overview of what things look like in Japan, I'm just going to touch quickly on 3 points in terms of what it means for implications. Is this good or bad for the economy? Well, basically, and here's another far too small graph I'll explain in a moment, Japan has a group of skilled workers with good human capital, higher than native, and they take on the jobs that Japanese can't do. They're better educated than most. They're good for the workforce. There's also a sizable group of foreign workers doing manual labor, typically on temporary contracts doing dispatch work. They take on the jobs natives don't want. 3D in English, the dangerous, dirty, difficult jobs, or in Japanese, 3K, kitsui, kitanai, kiken. These sorts of jobs that natives don't want. Those too are actually good for the economy. Now, of course, foreign workers often get brought up in the context of demographic decline. The government would like to keep the population at about 100 million. There's a prediction that the workforce of about 65 million is going to drop to about 55 million in the next 2 decades or so. And in this part, things don't really look for Japan. So if you compare, good for Japan. So if you look at Japan versus its OECD neighbors, this is from the OECD International Migration Database, and there they show new additions to the workforce based on whether they're youth in the country moving into the workforce, and or whether they're foreigners moving into the workforce as well. So this first bar, number 1, is what keeps the workforce steady, right about here. You want to be at least there in order to maintain your workforce. The light-colored bar shows national youth moving into the workforce. Japan, it's a large proportion. Japan is at the very, very bottom, but it's not quite at replacement. And the dark side is the number of foreigners moving into the workforce as well, pushing it higher. Again, Japan, along with just about the Czech Republic, are the only members of the OECD that aren't being able to sustain the workforce in this way. And it's substantially below the OECD average. So, and to be honest, foreigners alone are not going to plug this gap. They're not really a solution to this. Nonetheless, they're a great deal in terms of the labor force. They come to a country in the prime of life. They pay taxes. The country, in the end, outsources education costs to the sending country. It even also often outsources retirement costs, because many people want to return home for their retirement. They're not such a drag on the welfare state in Japan, which is really aimed at people who retire. The welfare state in Japan is all about pensions and health care. So actually, it's not too bad having them in the country. If we look very quickly at crime statistics, all I'd like to say is that these are very tricky to deal with. And what I wanted to mention here is just that I think when we talk about crime and foreigners, we need to do so always with a note of caution. So for example, rape numbers are very hard to take simply at face value because many people are reluctant to report rape. But if there's a public enlightenment program to encourage this sort of thing, then the number of rapes will immediately spike, which is not really an indication of the number of rapes going on, just people's likeliness of reporting them. And these sorts of things go on with crime statistics all the time. So if we look, for example, this is a graph from the National Police Agency. It shows crimes committed by foreigners. Now, the blue part at the very top are crimes that only foreigners can commit, like overstaying visas. Natives simply can't commit these kind of crimes. They're kind of irrelevant in that sense. The yellow bars are the number of crimes, other sorts of criminal acts committed by foreigners, and the red bar are arrests of foreigners. Now, often in the media, remember there were a couple of big waves of looking at, oh no, a huge explosion of foreigner crime, those moments of uptick. Now, what this graph, though, doesn't show, which shows everything from Showa 57, which is, like 1955, I'm really bad with those dates, all the way up to Heisei 23, which is quite recent, late 2000s, that over this period of time, the number of foreigners in the country has also doubled. This is not taken into these accounts of this huge explosion of foreigner crime. If you look at the actual percentages, it shows a much steadier rate of change, actually. What these sorts of graphs that often appear in the media in order to highlight foreign crimes, and they rarely focus on the decline, which we've seen in recent years as well, is that if we look at overall crimes committed in Japan, they've surged among the Japanese as well. This comes from the National Police Agency again. The big pink graph going from 1982 to 2010 shows a huge increase across the late 90s, something of a decrease. Same time foreigner crimes were decreasing as well. And that little tiny blue thing you probably can't even see is the percentage of crimes committed by foreigners. So all of this needs to be put in context, I think, and it's very rarely done in talking about criminality and foreigners in Japan. The final topic I want to talk about is integration. You may recognize this woman. It's the second question on the quiz. She's the author Sono Ayako, who hit the news in February for a piece in which she ran in a newspaper in which she said that foreigners are all okay, but really they should live in segregated areas like under apartheid South Africa. It's hard to imagine anyone in the government or acting as an advisor to the government in Whitehall to be able to say something like this and not be skewered by the media. But nonetheless, this is where things sort of lie in Japan. You can get voices like this getting massive public attention. Nonetheless, there have been a lot of attempts to improve integration of foreigners within Japan. There's been a lot of positive effort on this front, but largely at the local level. And in a sense, that's where it matters. Migrants are always geographically concentrated. They're always in particular cities, particular regions, and that's where the efforts really should be placed. And in Japan, these integration efforts come under the umbrella of tabuku kyosei, or multicultural coexistence, and often come in the form of, say, language classes, helps with bureaucracy, international exchange classes, and the like. Now, the success of these sort of integration efforts carried out at the city level very often have been hit and miss. Depends a lot on the particular people involved in each locality, and I think that's something that Japan really can improve with more regional networking, more strategic positions, and simply more funding say, for example, schools who are involved in these things. Because here in the question of integration, children are really a key concern. And currently in Japan, there's about 25,000 non-native Japanese-speaking students in schools. It's very hard to get numbers on this, but that's sort of a rough image of the number of children who are involved in this. And the reason why children who are so important to these integration matters are because most research has shown that families are the key place to promote integration. It can come in two forms. One is through the socialization of children in schools, and they go home and also help their parents, etc. The other way is through marriage and intermarriage, which is what we've seen with in the Zainichi Korean case as well. So families really are key to these integration issues, and it would be great to see more support in this area. Now, of course, some people get concerned with protecting Japan's putatively unique culture. Foreigners, often barbarians at the gates, who don't know how to act. I've written a book about the tea ceremony. There's so much about Japanese culture that I absolutely love. But one thing I'm always impressed with is the great diversity within Japan. From everything from drunken salarymen to ganguro girls on the streets to the homeless. And this is also a big issue. Somewhere, I think it's about 15% of Japanese people are now at poverty level. And that's, not for better, but probably for worse, a great driver of diversity within Japan. A lot of people will talk about things like, foreigners don't know how to get along here, but they won't be able to learn all the rules. But if you take something like, say, separating rubbish, which is very important in Japan, showing that you're a good member of the community, what group do you think is the worst rubbish separators of all? Young single men. And you don't see landlords refusing to give them a lease on a flat because of it. Now, the other issue is language. Now, of course, Japanese is difficult and kanji is very hard, but most foreigners now are Chinese, which gives them enormous leg up in the language. It's really much, much less of an issue for them. So the upshot, just to wrap it up, the problem, I'd say, is not of people staying and coming to Japan, but of people leaving. Migrants typically want to go home. They're earners, they're target earners, they want to earn and then go back home. And Japan would be so lucky to keep people like the 200,000 students in the country after they graduate. So I'm going to wrap it up there, and thank you for your attention.
Curtains can be opened. And good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for having me here. My job is to hold up the European mirror to the excellent talk on Japan and on immigration in Japan that you've just heard. And to do so partly because, of course, one of the irritating things that Europeans, and certainly Americans, but including Europeans, often do with relative to Japan is that we give constant lectures about how important it is that Japan should increase immigration, and that it's an obvious solution to a demographic problem and to declining population, and probably would boost productivity in many sorts of ways. And yet we in Europe, of course, are fighting like wild cats with each other about precisely this issue of immigration. As we speak, migrants are being held up at the border at Ventimiglia, and there's a fight between Italy and France over where these migrants belong, where they should go. Immigration is a key and very hot political issue in the Danish elections that are about to happen. And of course, immigration is a substantial factor in the British debate about membership of the European Union and all the issues that surround the referendum that we will have over the next 2 years. So it's funny that we Europeans offer Japanese lectures about the need for more immigration and yet hate it when we have it ourselves. So why is that, and what is the situation? Well, as someone who worked for The Economist and as someone who thinks of himself as an economist, I'll start with the economics of immigration. Because actually, as you also got a foretaste of, the fact is that if you get economists to answer the question about whether immigration is beneficial, whether immigration should happen, whether more of it is better than less, then there is barely any dispute among economists. On any subject there is some dispute among economists, but basically the economics of immigration from the point of view of the economists are entirely clear. An increase in labor supply that is provided by immigration creates growth in GDP, though not necessarily in GDP per head, but in a well-run economy with a high technical standard, that actually typically is found to increase GDP per head. Why? Because, as was said, immigrants portray what is economists call a selection bias. In other words, the people on average who make the effort to travel are younger, more healthy, and more enterprising. And finally, it's best of all for your country and its economy if those migrants who come have been well educated at someone else's expense. And that, in the British context, is especially true. Half our immigrants are from other European Union countries, the vast majority of whom have had excellent education to a high level. So that the conclusions of research, again, treating things as averages rather than specific anecdotes, have shown that immigrants in Britain have made a net contribution to public finances. Research from the University of London suggested 20 billion net tax versus welfare costs over a 10-year period. Immigrants in Britain are less likely to be unemployed than a typical British person, less likely to be on benefits. They're typically healthier, so on average they are less of a drain on the health service, and indeed EU migrants who have been, as I say, half the British flow are well educated. The only adjustment that one has to make to this clear conclusion among economists is about the difference between the short and the medium term. It's clear that if you add labour supply during a period when demand for labour is depressed by, for example, a recession or a financial crash as in 2008, that there will be almost automatically some depressing effect on wages of that. And of course also there are integration costs in absorbing immigrants that even an economist has to acknowledge, including language training, some skills acquisition, and some sort of social externalities, as economists would call them. So that's the economic picture. So not everyone agrees with it, but basically economists, if economists rule the world, then immigration would be very open. But the good news is, of course, is that economists don't rule the world. But the bad news is that the political, social, and cultural story about immigration is A, much more important, and B, far less clear. And that political, social, and cultural story is what leads both to serious disputes, politically and socially, over immigration in European countries, as well as to serious misperceptions, of course, about immigration. And both, I would say, the disputes and the misperceptions can be very dangerous, and even an economist would accept that they impose real costs. So that's where we are in Europe, and in this aspect of the fact that the social, political, and cultural issues related to immigration, I would say, are more important currently than the economic ones. In this aspect, Britain is entirely in line with Europe. We are, for once, totally European, or perhaps even in advance of some other European countries. In Europe, as we all know, nationalism is on the rise, a rejection by portions of our population of internationalism, whether represented by the European Union, or by globalization more generally, or by openness vaguely. That nationalism is on the rise, fueled especially by high unemployment, by fear of the conflicts that are going on around our borders, on the south side of the Mediterranean, to our eastern borders in Ukraine, the collapse of Syria, and by immigration, and by disputes about immigration. So this is the background, of course, to the rise of the UK Independence Party in this country to 13% of the vote. The Front National, the National Front in France, the Sweden Democrats in Sweden, the Danish People's Party, the Northern League in Italy, both separatist and anti-immigrant, and the Pejuga movement, anti-immigration movement in Germany. For in all our countries, immigration has recently been rising, and in fact, quite substantially. In Europe, unlike in Japan, we have essentially all historically been immigrant states, states that have typically had long histories over many centuries of immigration, of movement of peoples. But what we often don't pay attention to is the fact that since the Second World War, for several decades, much of that movement stopped. Indeed, the conclusion of the Second World War coincided with, caused an enormous amount of ethnic cleansing in the continent of Europe. Ethnic cleansing, as it became called in the Yugoslav wars, but in fact the exchanges of peoples that took place in Central Europe at the end of the Second War were essentially ethnic cleansing, as in previous eras exchanges between Greece and Turkey. And so actually Europe for a while became less intertwined in terms of the movement of people, less a continent of immigrants. If you look now, and I haven't done it as a PowerPoint slide, but I'll read out a few of the data, and importantly, I'll point out that my data on foreign shares of population are different from your data, even though they both come from the OECD. Why is this? Because another part of the issue about immigration, I would say, is differences of definition about what you mean by immigration. Who constitutes an immigrant? If, on the OECD data, you ask what percentage of the population is foreign born, has been born in another country, then for Britain, the latest figure is 12.4% in 2013, higher than your 7.7%. The figure in 2000, so 15 years ago from now, was just below 8%, so quite a substantial rise. In France, the number has been more stable, between 10.1 now to 11.6%. In Spain, the rise has been dramatic, from just under 5% 15 years ago to nearly 15% of the population now being foreign-born. Italy, a country that hasn't thought of itself as being an immigrant country in recent decades, even though, of course, Italy, being a peninsula in the middle of the Mediterranean, could not but be a country that was created by the movement of peoples over many centuries. Nevertheless, in 2000, only 2.5% of the population were foreign-born. So there's been a freezing of movement, even though many people in Venice have names that are linked to Arabic names, or people in Sicily are Albanians in origin, and so forth. So Italy is a cosmopolitan society in history, but in recent history had not been open to immigration, or not had a lot of immigration, but between 2000 and the latest data, the percent of Italy's population that's foreign-born has gone up from 2.5% to 9%. So quite a substantial rise there as well. And so on. I won't go on over all the figures. Sweden has been one of the highest rises, up to now 16%. So we've had, I think, a big increase in immigration in many of our countries. In the political discourse about immigration, the political wrangling and argument about this immigration, though, I would say that we should understand for our discussion that in different countries there are very different emphases in what is controversial about immigration and what is accepted about immigration. In Sweden, for example, the rise of the Sweden Democrats Party that featured in the last election last September is essentially a dispute about asylum seekers, because Sweden has been Europe's biggest receiver per head of population of asylum seekers, particularly from Syria and also from some other parts of North Africa. Around 80,000 asylum seekers in the last 12 months. And the dispute has been substantially about the numbers and about the welfare cost of absorbing them. In the UK, we've been actually pretty small recipients of asylum seekers. Indeed, we're notable for, in fact, rejecting asylum seekers currently, and we, among other European countries, are refusing to receive a quota of the migrants coming across the Mediterranean at present. Much of our argument has really been about East European labour, about the flow of workers from Romania or Bulgaria, most latterly, and previously Poland and the Baltic states and Hungary. In France, I would say that a lot of the debate, particularly since Charlie Hebdo earlier this year, but also I think through the rise of the Front National, has been about the clash between secularism, the secular state of France, and Islam, and actually about, in some ways, the highly segregated nature of many immigrant communities. paradox of the pro-apartheid voice in Japan is that actually in many European countries the very thing that people are worried about immigration is segregation, is ghettos and highly isolated groups. And in Italy, I think it's been a combination of these things, the rise of an anti-immigrant politics that has actually focused quite a lot on crime, as was shown here. So we have to accept, and we should accept, and we must take seriously that there is a genuine political problem that needs to be addressed about immigration. It takes different forms in different European countries. The economics of it are in many ways beside the point as far as these political problems are concerned. If we focus for a moment, and almost finally, on the UK, I'd just like to point out one or two things about the UK that explain some of our angst about immigration and the way in which it plays in our politics. First is we have that is at least an indication of it is that opinion pollsters find a very strong misperception about the extent of immigration in the UK. Ipsos Mori's opinion polls have asked sometime what percentage of the British population do you think are immigrants? And the average figure in the latest poll was 31% in the poll, whereas the figure is either 13 or 7.7, depending on the definitions that we use. What's the explanation for that? Well, one explanation may be, of course, as a definitional question, since a country like the UK, as with France, that has many second and third generation immigrants who came to Britain in the 1950s and beyond, they may be being included in a perceived number rather than the kind of statistical definition we're using. But also, I think that that shows is that politically the effect of immigration, the extent of immigration, is not a statistical number, it's an emotional issue, and about people's perceptions of their communities and the perceptions of how culture and society is being affected. The second big characteristic of the UK debate is, as I said, a conflation of this issue, immigration, with the issue of European Union membership. Strong correlation between UKIP voters and expressed concern in the opinion polls about levels of immigration of all kinds. And in many ways, I think also paradoxically that would seem to me that the economic analysis says that actually if you really are worried about the number of immigrants in the country, you should prefer European Union migrants to migrants from outside, because they typically are more better educated and more highly skilled. And actually the non-EU migrants, we have complete freedom of control over our borders if we wish to have it, regardless of whether we're in the European Union or not, whereas it's only the EU migrants who are affected by our membership of the European Union. But nevertheless, the two things have become, I think, tightly linked in public opinion about the European Union and about whether we should stay in. I think thirdly, because actually the UK, whatever George Osborne may say about our strong economic recovery, actually we let's perfectly echo what the feeling and the economic background for angst about immigration in other parts of Europe, because the key statistic about the British economy is that real wages have been falling for 7 successive years since the recession began, and that in a period in which real wages have been, inflation-adjusted wages have been declining so remorselessly during the recession, despite falls in unemployment, and have only just begun to creep above inflation. I think that is an atmosphere ripe for anxiety about immigration, and in particular for the sort of direction of an economic grievance at perceived cause of it, which is high levels of immigration. So finally, what solutions could we look at, and what maybe in the discussion we'll look at crossover between Europe and Japan, but what solutions can we look at? Well, it's clearly very hard, and also hard to know where the politics of immigration will go in any European country, including in this one. I think some of the principles are clear, though. One is that a key part of public policy towards immigration has to be to do with integration. That something that is shared across a number of European countries in different ways is a feeling that the integration effort, which often means expenditure, public expenditure on education, deliberate public effort to avoid segregated areas, deliberate public effort to help integrate communities, really needs to be much more part of it, part of policy towards immigration, and that having a purely laissez-faire policy is not a solution, is unwise. Secondly, that the fundamental background issue that fuels this is the state of the economy, so that we really need to work on improving that. Thirdly, that in public discourse, and particularly by communicators like me, about immigration, we need to find ways to differentiate in the public discourse about the different categories of immigration, particularly over the issues of asylum seekers and refugees on one hand, economic migrants on the other, and European Union versus non-EU. We have a tendency to see them all wrapped up together. But finally, and in conclusion, I think that even as an economist, I have to accept and must accept and stress for the debate that the social and cultural issues connected with immigration are the most important ones, and that that is where Europe and Japan, as it were, are connected on this issue, because that is, of course, as was said, the main concern in Japan, and it is really fundamentally the main concern in Europe. We don't think that zero is the right answer, however. Thank you.